Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. This is Jazz and Self-Determination number 3, but the second one to happen here at the People's Forum. And we're always very excited about presenting these talks here. And we thank you. Althea Sully Cole is going to do this panel discussion with me. And we're going to cover a variety of topics with the people on the panel today, and I'm appreciative that they came and shared their time with us today. And the objective is to bring individuals from different artistic mediums as well as creators of music that were guided by the jazz idiom somehow, not to see things so separate all the time in these discussions. So, because sometime in the history of panel discussions, sometimes things can be compartmentalized, and the ability to contextualize is important, but sometimes jazz seems to be such a motivating force across the board. It's good to have a panel of people who have been affected by it as educators, mathematicians, writers, and actual creators of music and organizers. And so we thank you. Our first panelist is Aurora Flores, musician, composer, educator, leader of the band Zone del Barrio, and also interviewer of great musicians that can be found on social media, on YouTube. Professor William J. Harris, writer, poet, and the editor of this book, among others. Professor Sam Anderson, educator, mathematician, and participant and witness of Black Arts movement of 1965. Professor Warren Smith on percussion. That sounded like a jazz record. Percussionist, educator, composer, mentor for many musicians, as a teacher and educator at SUNY Old Westbury, which him and Mr. Sam Anderson had in common. And we'll talk about that. And the proprietor of Studio Whis on 21st Street, famous loft space. And Althea is also the host of this discussion. Althea Sully Cole, practitioner of the kora, West African string instrument, which she studied directly in West Africa, and is an educator as well, writer, ethnomusicologist, participant in the restoration of Alan Lomax's field recordings. And so, Althea, what do you have?
Yeah, let's begin. These always tend to take a kind of improvised form, as is the theme. And I see, Professor Harris, you have a written statement there, and I'm really curious to hear what it says. So I'd love to start there if possible.
Oh, yeah?
If you're comfortable
sure.
with that. Otherwise, I can jump in with questions, but it's up to you.
No,
Let's hear it.
okay. So, and I'm very interested to hear other people. Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? Because it always annoys me when people don't talk in. Okay, so what I'm going to do is next year there is a collection coming out on Amiri Baraka, and it's called Some Other Blues, New Perspectives on Amiri Baraka. And it's going to be, I think, an important thing, and something's terrific. I do Baraka, and something that is terrific about Baraka studies is it hasn't died. There are all these young people involved, and the young people they're terrific, they're brilliant, and they're going places that some of us older people haven't gone. So what I have done is I wrote a piece for this collection, and the guy putting the collection together thought it could serve as an introduction to to the collection. So what I'm doing is, I'm just going to give you 800 words. I am an academic, but I'm not going to go on a long time. I'm going to give you 800 words from the introduction. The introduction has to do with place and the importance of place. This piece is about free jazz in particular and self-determination, but it happens in two parts. My, let's call it, introduction takes place, starts in January 1962 and ends March 1965. It starts with Amiri Baraka and Hetty Jones moving into an apartment, 27 Cooper Square, in the East Village. At Leroy Jones at that point, yeah. And his wife Hetty Cohen, and there's a jazz club down the street called the Five Spot. And so this divides back, this piece talks about the importance of these two locations, these two Lower East Side locations. So this is before, March 65, he moves to Harlem. This is right after the death of Malcolm X. So, in this essay, I explore two Lower East Side New York bohemian locations. 27 Cooper Square, the home of Mary Baraka, then Leroy Jones, and Hetty Jones, Baraka's first wife, and the Five Spot, a nearby club where the new black avant-garde was just being created. In the first section, I explore the house, the people who live there and in the area, their domestic space, and their parties. In the second section, I explore the Five Spot in two moments and places. Baraka attended the Five Spot often, and in this mixed club, he'd experienced the black avant-garde music articulated by exceptional musicians, particularly John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk. What is important about this world, unlike the world of the house, is the black musicians are the artists in sight and in control. And they are creating and defining a music which grows out of black culture. And moreover, they are original and highly accomplished. Thus, we have two communities, the white bohemian community of the house and the black avant-garde community that Baraka finds at the jazz club. Who lived in the house? The top floor was occupied by the writers Amiri and Hetty. There they edited the influential magazine Yugen and the important avant-garde press Totem. In short, they were the literary figures. Archie Shepp, the great jazz saxophonist, and his family lived in another apartment. So that adds the music. And the painter Elizabeth Murray, a MacArthur recipient, and her husband, Bob Holman, the poet and slam promoter, lived in the other apartment. There are only 3 apartments in this place. These artists had in common, what these artists had in common was a desire to fashion innovative art in their particular field, where we have a diverse group of artists living under one roof and influencing each other because they had similar radical ideas and because of their proximity. The house was a center of the New York bohemian scene. Hetty realizes the importance of parties as places to meet people, swap ideas, and expand horizons. In other words, they are serious business and need to be studied as part of the literary history. Thus, we are involved in an expanded literary history beyond individual genius, who is usually male and white. This is a story of a community relating to each other. This is a history which mixes the domestic, the social, the cultural, the artistic. And moreover, talking about space, place allows us to see these complex worlds and to relate. The history adds voices and perspectives, including female ones. 27 Cooper Square was an in-between place, Baraka writes. In one sense, our showing up on Cooper Square was right in tune with the whole movement of people east, away from the West Village, with its high rents and older bohemians. Cooper Square was a sort of borderline. That's from the autobiography. Part 2, the 5 spot. In a fittingly washed out photograph of the old five spot, located at 5 Cooper Square, just down the street from their apartment, sitting next to a pizza joint, one can see it is not glamorous. It doesn't look like one of the pivotal places where the revolution in black avant-garde music was taking place. There were many outstanding experimental musicians playing there over the years, including Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, Eric Dolphy, Randy Weston, Sonny Murray, and Thelonious Monk. But the magic came with Charles Mingus. But the magic came with one Thelonious Monk, advanced pianist, and his quartet. The 5 spot was a different dwelling place from 27 Cooper Square. Different values dominated. White avant-garde genius dominated the house at Cooper Square, even though it dominated, sorry, one more time. The white avant-garde dominated the house at Cooper Square, and even though it was a mixed club owned by 2 white brothers, black artistic genius dominated the 5 spot. Black genius set the standards, not white genius. At 27 Cooper Square, Baraka perhaps unconsciously took on the white aesthetic standards and values. In 1965, Baraka says, "Having read all of Whitey's books, I wanted to be an authority on them. Having been taught that art was what white men did, I almost became one and have to go, almost became one to have a go at it." His new teachers, headed by Monk, allowed him to follow his own tradition, let him write in his own language, freed him from fashioning his words in an alien language of another tribe. The music, like James Brown, let him identify a place and image in America. He needed a dwelling place nourished by black genius to fully become himself. He needed space free from white hegemony. He needed a space where he could pick and choose among ideas. He needed a space where he could embrace black radical art unencumbered, free from the dictates and controlling consciousness of the white avant-garde. Even though William Carlos Williams helped him along the way, if he had not found the music, he would not have found himself. He would not have found himself because the music is grounded in the black blues tradition.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Harris.
I can read it more smoothly, but it didn't somehow happen.
Professor Flores, what are the parallels that you see in that? Because your history has the same trajectory with Afro-Cuban music. I almost don't want to say parallel because there's very little difference in these experiences. But
Oh,
it seems like the same efforts were underway, organizing and embracing the music.
Raj, there's a lot of similarities. And first I want to thank you for being here and being in with so many distinguished people. And I love the introduction, except you forgot one thing. Although I did my first record at 15 years old,
Yes.
Playing string bass in a classical orchestra, and I was first chair of the bass section. And I was 15, like all of this big, but my career has always been in writing. And I was the first woman, not woman of color, the first woman music correspondent for Billboard magazine, when there was still signs that said, unescorted women not allowed. And I think it's important to bring the issue of women into this, because even in your essay, women are not allowed except as decorations or partners. And but there's so many similarities in what you're saying. And yes, place is really important. And look at place first. When I think of place and when I think of the Puerto Rican Latino community coming up, I think of East Harlem. We put a Puerto Rican imprint on East Harlem, starting in the 20s, starting when James Reese Europe put together the first all-black orchestra to tour Europe, and 18 of those black guys were from Puerto Rico, starting with Rafael Hernandez and Juan Tisol, who then came back, and they got them from the marching bands. And one thing about Puerto Rico and the islands was, even though they had enslaved Africans, because of the marching bands, every town had a marching band, they were sponsored by Spain. And so there were entire families, black families, who were professional musicians. They arranged, they played, and also all of that, when you study it, there was a way of coming out of slavery through the church and those original conquistadors, because they wanted entertainment. And that's how this music fused. It was a fusion of the European music, because the artists from Europe weren't going to the islands. They weren't going to come to the islands. So it had to happen there. So it was a fusion of the European people and then the drumming. And the drum, to me, is very important because the drum was outlawed. The drum speaks. Drum has magic. In Africa, the first people on the front line are the drummers. So here the drum was taken away. And when you take away a drum from people like that who came with the knowledge, not only of making drums, they came with the knowledge of these patterns, they have to replace it with something else. I see so many similarities when I see people doing tap dancing. Tap dancing to me, or hambone, they're rhythms. And I hear clave in it, which is the 5-note metronomic Afro-Caribbean beat that brings all of this together. So in East Harlem, these guys who toured Europe with an all-black band came back. They had just made us citizens. We didn't ask for that. We went to sleep, and the next day, all of a sudden, we are U.S. citizens. We didn't climb over walls. It was just done without no one telling us. And then they started taking down the marching bands. So they knew the writing was on the wall. So when Rafael Hernandez came back with all these other Latino musicians, they came to East Harlem. 1927, first Latino record store. Now that tells you how many Puerto Ricans were already there. If he could open up a record store with his sister and make a living. And then at that time, Latin music was getting big. You had the first Peanuts. Da 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 da. That was $1 million. See, the people, they remember that. That was $1 million hit, the first one. And it came out of Cuba. And at the time, all these big band leaders wanted the syncopation of Latin music. Latin music and jazz go hand in hand because of the improvisation. And the improvisation, when you hear improvisation, you hear jazz. And what you were talking about, these geniuses, these musicologists, musical geniuses, writers, and then your average people hanging out. I mean, of course, being here, they were infused with the white Eurocentric music, but that improvisation was still in them. And the difference between European musicians and Latino musicians, who are also based in African musicians and in Africa, we make music on the spot. Europeans have to think about it first in their heads, and then they got to write it down. That we do it there. We start a circle, we have a fire, we start dancing, someone picks up a beat. It happens in the bars. These clubs, they were so famous because you never knew, it wasn't the same music all the time. It was something different. And that's what Latin music has. And you had places in El Barrio, from El Barrio it went to the Bronx. And there was a time in the Bronx where there was, in the South Bronx, one club after another, after another, after another. Those same bohemians you talk about there in that essay were the same ones who would go on Sundays, like church, to 110th Street, to the Park Palace, to dance rumba. And this was huge, because Peanuts gave rise to rumba. Somehow, one of the record companies misspelled it and put an H on it, Rumba. And then after World War II, when the Jews came in, they embraced this music, especially rumba, like their own. But they did it more like a foxtrot. They didn't do it like the way they do it in Cuba. But here we are in New York with all these Puerto Ricans looking at Afro-Cuban music, Afro-Puerto Rican music, Glenn Miller coming to hire them to do this music. Duke Ellington sees Juan Tisol playing in a circus. He brought his family to, and he heard that trombone, and he said, oh my God, I need to get this guy. He comes into Duke Ellington's band, and Caravan is born. And these are classics. So I find the Latino strain is very strong. It's just no one's really written about it. I don't know if it's the language, and not only Spanish, we also bring in the music in African, in Abakwa, in Yoruba, and a big, Sammy Davis Jr. did a whole song using, this is all rumba from Cuba. Not rumba up in the Catskills, rumba from Cuba. So all of this is percolating, and it's so similar to what you're saying and what was going on in the 50s, the whole Harlem Renaissance. They didn't have the language, but they had orchestras. Like Hugo Dickens had these big band orchestras that were just like Tito Puente, just like Tito Rodriguez, just like Machito. But since they didn't have a lead singer that was Spanish, so they couldn't do the call and response, so they just do the chorus like cha-cha-cha, que rico cha-cha-cha. Anyone could sing that, you know. So they do that. But this was huge in Harlem. In the Palladium on Sundays, they used to call it a Harlem Night. They had contests. People would come. And when I was growing up, and I grew up in Harlem, if you didn't know how to Latin, you were not hip. You have to Latin. And most of the older men I know could come from Harlem. I bet you Latin, right? Do you Latin? You Latin. See? It was something we did because actually it's inside us. Latin music, the roots are in Africa. They went from Africa to this new world, to the islands where it developed, but it found the spotlight in New York. And it was right next to that's why the jazz guys and the Latino guys, they got along because they understood bebop, just like they understood abacua. They understood the beats. All the beats say something. All the patterns say something. And to me, it's just a portal. It's a mystical portal. It's a mystical portal to me that unites the world.
I'm seeing there are some strong reactions over here. If either of you would like to respond to, yes?
Well, I will say that sounds very familiar to me. I'm sitting over here laughing. I grew up in Chicago in my early years, and we lived on the south side of Chicago, and the main thing that I carry with me from Chicago is that nothing really has changed much in the 85 years I've been here. And it's that in itself seems kind of strange, but on the south side, we grew up in what is now still the most segregated large city in the United States of America. The north side had its own culture and whatnot. The south side had its own. The west side is encompassed by the south side because so many black people moved there that it kind of blended in with the so-called loop in between, you know, which is where all the big businesses are. But even today, it remains that way. But now, I never felt any sadness or disparity or lack of what I was looking for because it was such a rich culture within there. My father was a musician, my mother was a musician. All of their siblings on both sides of the family were all musicians. And when I got old enough to consider college, I decided I was going to study architecture because I knew I was going to be a musician, but I didn't want to be a musician and work in the post office, which was what they were all doing, you know, because there simply wasn't enough economic substance. And I mean, and my father worked every night in a nightclub, put on a tuxedo, you know, and all that kind of stuff. All of my relatives, they were all, 3 of my aunts are organists and pianists who can improvise, who were doing that before Jimmy Smith made it popular on the organ, you know. Several of my father and several of his brothers and many of my cousins played the saxophone. I was able to sit up as a young kid and watch Charles Christopher Parker, the Bird, come to our house to get his horn fixed by my father, and sit there and listen to stories that all these different people came in and exchanged. It wasn't just Charlie Parker, by the way. It was everybody that came through Chicago. And I'm sitting there listening to all this stuff, and I knew that I was going to be a musician because I joined the Musicians Union when I was 14 years old. I mean, that's when you could join, so I joined. And the Musicians Union was an all-black musicians union in Chicago, Local 208. And finally, when I was grown and they decided to amalgamate all the unions all over the country, which they did, it's now Local 10208 because they had a white musicians union that we couldn't belong to. One of the interesting experiences I had, one of the reasons why they told me to go to New York was that as soon as I got here, I started meeting different people, and I wound up doing a Broadway show as a substitute. The show was The West Side Story. One of my college classmates was in the show, and he brought me in as his substitute. So the show goes on the road, and the third city that we went to after Denver and Detroit was Chicago. Now, I bumped right up against the Musicians Union. They said, well, all you out-of-town musicians are going to have to join the Musicians Union. I said, not me. And they said, well, yes, you are. You're going to have to join. You're from New York. I was in the New York Musicians Union, but I was also in Local 208. And I showed them that card, and they hadn't seen anybody from Local 208, which was all black local, in Broadway in Chicago. You know, so I don't know if I was the very first one, but that kind of opened up a color line that was there before. And it's still not erased. But I mean, these kinds of things are going on all around me. And I mean, we played all kinds of music, you know, both as performers and as listeners. And I mean, all this stuff was going on in Chicago. But New York had many more opportunities because you would not, in those days, get into a Broadway show without being white in Chicago. You know, and it was hard in New York too. But being on the road, I came in with the show, and so they had to honor that contract. And these kinds of things, just, you know, you hear so many stories like this. You know, these kinds of likenesses that happen over and over and over again through school, through professional life, and when you start getting older and you retire, you're still running up and bumping up against all these things. So I've never had how should I say, any expectations that I wouldn't have to fight for my rights and go on with this kind of opposition, you know, usually because of color, you know. But I mean, I fell into so many different things. I became a university professor. My brother went down to Howard University and became a university professor. And we retired from that. But now my brother is a painter. And that's what he wanted to do. And he does that too. And he's got pieces hanging in the museums in Washington, D.C., in the new African American History Museum. There's something that my brother painted in there.
What's his name?
His name is Frank Smith.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he was part of a group of African painters from Chicago called Afro-Cuban. And while they were revitalizing, you know, gentrification was invading the South Side where we lived, and they were tearing down a lot of places, but there was one wall that this group of artists came upon that hadn't been torn down yet. And they painted what they called the Wall of Respect. Oh. And all of the heroes that we had in the African American community were painted on that wall. And when they got ready to take that building down, everybody took photographs of it, and some of the artists took pieces of that wall and saved it and have it to this day. You know, these are things that are very valuable because we want to remember, we want to remind our kids, just in case any of them might have to go through some of the same shit that we went through, that there is a way to continue to fight these inequities and to make sure that they don't happen to other people, no matter who they are, you know. So, to me, the whole thing is, it's an active fight that we're still engaged in. And I'm going to keep on, you know, got a few more years, I think. Yeah. All right, so.
Brother Warren has brought out a lot of memories, and Sister Aurora also brought a lot of memories. I'm not a musician. I'm a student of history and a mathematician, but I'm also a revolutionary activist in the United States. And my convergence into this whole discussion about black music, the American classical music, also known as jazz, comes from struggle, comes from my upbringing as a person coming out of Bedford-Stuyvesant in a family that grandfather is a Garveyite and a labor trade unionist. He worked on the piers in New York City during World War II, and you know, influencing us. And then music was always within us in our family. Our family was a fantastic mixture of Southern folk and folk from the Caribbean. You know, Jamaica, Barbados, and the Carolinas. And so you had this great mix of music there. And that's how I came up with this great mix of music. And so introducing the jazz was not a thing that I was interested in when I was like 14, 15 years old. When a good friend of ours, of our family, introduced me to Miles Davis, I said, and then, but a few years later, it began to make sense because I was politically active, and that political activism began to raise questions about everything, and part of everything was about music, and you know why. I'd never heard this music before. What is the connection between, as Sister Aurora was pointing out, the Latin musical scene and the jazz scene and the R&B, and then you're in New York and you hang out and you go to a dance club and they play Latin music. If you don't, like you said, if you didn't dance, you know, then you were lame, you know, so you know none of the sisters would be interested in you, so you had to deal with that, and so you know it was a evolution, personal evolution of understanding that if you're a political activist, that in the early 1960s, you were also a cultural worker. There was no in between. And for me, my interest was in the study of mathematics, and initially I had no sense of the connection between my mathematical studies and the studies of African history and music and so forth. That came later. Not that much longer, later, but it just came like, I would say, 5 or 6 years later. Then you see this connection happening. The other realization that we came upon is that jazz musicians, particularly jazz musicians, are fundamentally intellectual workers. They are, they think about their music, they work in the musical field in reference to the daily struggles of black people. And it may happen indirectly for a lot of people and directly for some people. But in this period of growing up in the 1960s and 70s, it was very clear that the guiding force, the leading force in quote-unquote jazz music were the jazz musicians who were progressive thinkers. And for example, the online promotion for this gathering has the album cover, Max Roach's group, We Insist. And those brothers on the album cover were the people who were involved in the sit-in movement, right? And Sister Abby, absolutely. The album itself, you listen to the music, white folks would call it protest music, right? And you have this wide variety of music that is political on the album. A major statement in terms of black music in the 1960s, the We Insist album. And that had impact on those of us who were politically active and not musicians. We had intimate relationships with those jazz musicians. Myself, I was a roommate with Andrew Hill when both of us were looking for a place to stay. We wound up staying together in an apartment that was, I guess you'd call it today, homesteading, right? It's a polite term, right? Yeah. So we did that for about a month or two, in that, and squatters, right? Exactly. We did that for about a month or two until we were able to, both of us were able to get, something else. But that interchange between those of us who were politically active and not musicians, and the musicians, particularly in New York City, was essential to understand. My good comrade Larry Neal was a close associate with Amiri Baraka and Sun Ra and a whole host of other people. So there was this whole convergence of culture, of the blending of the genre, if you will. That was so very, very important in that period, that transformed not only Black America, but transformed America in that period. That Black Arts movement was a transformational period for American culture, just like the early stages of jazz in the 1920s and 30s was a transformational period for American music. You could not watch any movie from the 1930s or 40s without hearing black music. Just think about that. No, you could not hear, it was there. So that power, the power of jazz and what we call in a general thing, black music is so central to American culture. And that's why I think it's important for us to talk about it as the American classical music form, right? And so not just say classical music. When you say classical music, that is a Eurocentric a phrase, because what conjures up in people's head is Beethoven, Mozart, and so forth. So you would have to say American classical music, Indian classical music, right? Caribbean classical music, Latin classical music, various African classical music. So the challenge, I think that what came out of this period of jazz in the 1960s was to challenge the genre, to challenge how we speak about music, how we live with music, and for the musicians, how we perform music. And last thing I want to say is that how we perform music, I think one of the most cutting edge musicians of the 50s and 60s was Sun Ra, right? Because he took the European classical music art form, he took the traditional jazz art form, and just took it to a whole new level, as he said, to Saturn, to outer space, and brought just brought a mesmerizing experience to music to the people, right? I don't know if you were there when Jazzmobile existed in Harlem.
Absolutely.
And Jazzmobile had Sun Ra perform on 135th Street and St. Nicholas. And, I don't think they expected what happened. But his whole orchestra was there. And the greatest thing that happened, this was 1969, 1970, or something like that, 71. So the greatest thing that happened was the kids loved it. All the kids in the neighborhood, they came out and they loved it because the costumes, the dancing, the music, they just loved it. They were just into the music. And as you may know, Sun Ra does not play in sound bites. So we're like about 4 hours of this nonstop music with the children having great fun, and to me, that represented, it represents our music and how it could tap into all ages, with Sun Ra performing. But also, it was a political statement that you can have in your community these extremely talented musicians performing for the people.
I think I just want to say during that time, like you said, that was such a great period of time for music, and like you said, American music. 1963 was a pivotal year for Latin music and jazz, because that was the year that Mongo Santa Maria
Yes.
comes out and he copies Herbie Hancock's Watermelon Man.
Right. Right.
And then he hits with Afro Blue.
Right.
And he's taking African scales with a Latin clave and putting it into a jazz format. Right. No one had ever done that before. Right. And this was the bridge to what Latinos, the younger Latinos, started doing, because at the time we had music in the schools. And right after that, Joe Cuba hits with El Pito. Right. Bang, bang. And he took in El Pito, he took a line from, I think it was Dizzy Gillespie, I'll Never Go Back to Georgia.
Right.
And this became a rallying call on the protest lines. Right. So here we are, blacks and Latinos, we're living together in the projects, we're going to the same schools, they're working in the same factories, they're in the same jails, and we're marching on the same protest lines, and from everywhere. This is what you were hearing. You were hearing soul music, R&B, and the Latin music.
Exactly.
And this was such a great way. It was political. Right. And then right after that, when salsa happened, you had Eddie Palmieri talking about Justicia. You had Ray Barretto talking about Together. You had Tony Pavon, who had an album, Protesta. You had Ernie Agosto and La Conspiración. And I have to tell you, the few Latin programs that were around, because we had no Latin radio, there were Latin programs, and these were, and I had to say it, the light-skinned Cubans after 1962 went to Miami. Right. The black Cubans came here and the Chinese, because you know there were Chino Cubano restaurants and botanicas all over. But the ones that came and took over the radio and TV stations were white Cubans, and they hated this music.
Right.
They said we were crazy. Why were we protesting? They were coming from a revolution.
Right.
They would not play it.
Right, right,
What gave rise to this music were the black DJs on the jazz stations.
That's fascinating.
And then the Jews, the Jewish DJs, Symphony Sid, Dick
Right,
Ricardo
Symphony.
Sugar.
Yeah.
They even spoke Spanish.
Right.
It was an incredible thing. So you had also the Jewish people who gave rise when Max Roach and Maya Angelou, and they wanted Art Delugoff. He gave them
Right.
the Village Gate.
Village
I mean,
Gate,
so
yeah.
all of this, it's very, if you really look at it, we were doing it together.
Right.
But this country has such a way of separating
Absolutely.
people, even food, TV dinners. They separate everyone. I mean, it's true. I've never seen such a thing. So, I mean, I'm saying all
Yeah.
this because unfortunately I have to leave because I made another.
Oh.
But yeah, I
But
want to
it's-
stay
it's-
now, but I
but
want to
it's-
leave.
Yeah, it's great to say this.
Yeah, because I wanted to
yeah,
say this.
yeah.
And also, like I said, I've been a writer. I have like over 3,000 articles, but I have a few articles on Medium that you might like. I just wrote this article that people like. It was about the first time I met Tito Puente before the Me Too movement. So,
So
did you read
where-
that? Yeah. So that's
how do we-
online.
How we find it? Just
Online
look up
on
your name?
Medium.
Medium.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And if you look up my name, the title of the piece is An Audience with the King.
Okay.
Because you know, you have meetings with regular people, but you have an audience with the king. Now, I was like 19 years old. This was my first assignment. And I knew Tito. That was like interviewing Frank Sinatra, because it was my parents' music, but still, he was a huge, it was a great thing. But I have to apologize because I have to leave.
Oh,
Okay.
I'll be back.
Yeah.
I will definitely be back, sorry.
Well,
All right.
so glad.
Yes, so glad to meet you. Yes. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Aurora Flores Part 2 coming up, so stay tuned.
Yes.
And
May I do something? Just a question? Because you held up Black Fire, which probably you all know was a very important 1968 volume edited by Baraka and Neal. You have a piece in it. Two, sorry, actually I knew that. And I was just I'm really interested about, somebody who was in it. How did you respond to it? How did you get in? How did you get in it? How did it happen? Or do you know? Or
It was very subjective. I was a good friend of Larry Neal.
oh,
Right.
that helped.
And we were instrumental in, this is a whole different topic for another subject here at the People's Forum. We were part of the original foundation of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party started in Harlem in May of 1966, not San Francisco.
Okay.
Okay? And by about a dozen of us who were here in New York. Larry was one of them, among others. And so we were very close as comrades. And I was writing and performing poetry while still trying to do my education, teaching, and what have you. And so Larry and Amiri, then Leroy Jones, were pulling together a lot of writers, black writers from across the country. And so Larry said, you should submit something. So I submitted 2 or 3 poems to the body, to Larry and Amiri, and then I think there was a person who was doing the editing and so forth. And so that's how I wound up in there, in that.
You can go ahead.
yeah, and the purpose of the 3rd edition of this discussion is really coming out in a very thorough way, which I'm appreciative of, showing the connections as far as migration patterns and embracing of the culture and all the cultural retention that one carries in new environments, and how that translates into even making these art forms even newer and the descriptions that are put onto the different parts of the music's evolution, and tying it in with how the music itself impacted people coming from different disciplines, as well as being actual practitioners of music. And
yeah, I'd love to think a little bit through some of the themes that have been coming up so far, and particularly how you started with this mapping of the space and place of blackness as a space of collaboration in opposition to one of whiteness, which is one that is individualistic, right? And the struggle against that. I really appreciated Professor Flora's comments that is really about the internal struggle in that binary picture, right, of Latinx or women, feminist narratives that have been erased over time. But nevertheless, there seems to be solidarity, right, in this sense of struggle, right? And Professor Anderson brought up this wonderful point of the musician as an intellectual worker, which I think is a really interesting formulation. And I'm curious as to whether there is agreement at this table across the board, because when you bring up that Sun Ra performance at Jazzmobile, what I think about is someone who stimulates thought. And it's not that he's not politically engaged, but through these aesthetics, through this collaboration, through this mode, he's producing engagement, you know? And so I'm curious to hear your all thoughts on the work of jazz, on the labor of jazz in the movement of struggle. Is it more important for you as an intellectual one, as an aesthetic one, as a collaborative mode? I'd love to hear further thoughts on that.
I've been reminiscing over a couple of experiences I had, and Sam and I shared an experience of the State University of New York at Old Westbury when it was first formulated. They gathered a bunch of, I would say, the most out professors of any profession that you could think of, and he and I turned up as part of this thing, you know, and what they allowed us to do was to construct a curriculum organically. In other words, the way I felt that music should be taught, the way he felt that mathematics and things of this sort should be taught, and I mean in every field. And very early in, it had to be the early 1970s, I remember having an experience. Now, I have to do this, make this statement first. My present wife introduced me to the great guitar player, Jimi Hendrix, all right? And when I first met her, and this was like more than 50 years ago, because at that time she was still a teenager. I had met her in Bennington College at a music conference where her father was involved. And she turned me on to this man. Well, in the early 1970s, he and I were at a school conference at the State University of Old Westbury, and I got kind of upset, not upset, I was a little bit disturbed because all the bands had to play the Star-Spangled Banner, you know. I was feeling a little bit angry. I don't know, something had spurred me close to what's spurring me now with the you know, the current administration in this country. And so I told my band, okay, we're going to play this, now watch me. And they all knew, even in those days, if I said take it out, they were going to take it out, you know. So we played the first phrase, oh, say, can you see? And I looked at the band, and everybody just went crazy. You know, this, way before now, I hadn't even heard of Jimi Hendrix, you know. And at each phrase, as we did it, we went, you know, and we just distorted it as much as we could to show our collective anger for what was going on in this country at that time. And I made sure that I conducted it so that they didn't think that everybody was just fucking around, you know. And and then I cut them off, and everybody cut off, and then cut them off, you know. And everything was really very, you know. And so we did this whole thing, and we got finished, and then we just sat down, and the audience was quiet. And then all hell broke loose. Everybody just got up and expressed their emotions because of this. And of course, I got a notice from the president afterwards, but he decided that he wouldn't be able to do anything politically to me because of the interaction that the whole student body and the faculty had shown for this. But then later on, Jimi Hendrix comes up and does this thing with the Starstruck Man, and it becomes a hit. Well, I missed out on that one, but the effect was there.
We talk about pomp and circumstance.
Yeah, how about that?
We'll have a Q&A. We'll have a Q&A after we introduce our next speaker. Thank you, baby.
Let this be a little
Yeah.
I just wanted to get to. We've just been graced by the presence of Mr. David Henderson, who was our other member of the panel, educator, writer, participant in this publication, and part of the foundation of what is called the Black Arts Movement through the Umbra's Writers Workshop. And we've just been touching on the beginning stages of that and moving chronologically. And to follow up on the point that Althea just made, I'd like to have you speak on your the development of the Umbra Writers Workshop. Since it's tied in with the jazz idiom itself, bringing together people from different disciplines, even outside of playing music, who have been affected by it, even through writing, and the need to organize artistically and all the sociological implications with that. Thank you, sir.
Well, you know, Jimmy, who I am?
Yes, because he didn't say his name.
I think I did. This is Mr. David Henderson, the author of this book, and a very great biography of Jimi Hendrix that had her first title, Voodoo Child of the Aquarian Age, and then, excuse me while I kiss the sky. But Mr. Henderson will tell us.
Well, you know, Ornette Coleman always said that he thought that Jimmy's Star Spangled Banner was a work of genius. Man. He really liked that.
Yeah, use the
He
mic.
thought it was a work of genius, Ornette Coleman did. So, you know, Umbra started out in the Lower East Side, which was a much more of a ghetto type situation than it is now with the gentrification. It's like you never believed that it was so funky as it was. And it was really great, you know, in that respect, you know. And, you know, Jimmy had come downtown. Richie Haven told him to stop living up there in Times Square in them SROs and to come down to the village to live, you know. And McDougal Street was a perfect place because you could make some money, not a lot of money, but the wives, they would make some money. And and they had the Fat Black Pussycat with Ted Jones was making money as a poet. And oh God, a lot of the folk singers were doing stuff here. Dylan and Len Chandler and Richie Havens got his start in Bleecker Street in the West Side. That didn't mean that all people lived there, because a lot of people lived in the East Village and walked across town and back, you know, to do their thing. And yeah. So Umbra was, Ishmael Reed just saw him. He has a play. He was one of the members of it. Calvin Harrington, Lorenzo Thomas, Askia Muhammad Touré, and some of the people may not, or, you know, be known, that broadly known, but in terms of black arts and in terms of the New York School of Poetry and other groups, they are well known. Norman Pritchard, for instance, you know. Let's see. So Ishmael's play is it at the New Yorker Money now? It's called Haunting. I don't know why he called it Haunting, but basically he's making a comment on on that play called Hamilton, which I think is really hilarious, because the only way you could get hip hop on Broadway was to distort history. I mean, it's amazing to me. You know.
Is Henry Dumas a member of Umbra?
No, but you know, we did a thing at Umbra. We did something in '66 at the Fillmore East, which was then called the Village East. We did a poetry reading there. We did a poetry reading there. And it was great, you know, and Ginsberg participated in that, and some of the Free Southern Theater people, and a whole bunch of different people, because it wasn't just Umbra people, but afterwards, Henry and I talked right outside there for maybe 2-3 hours, because he was just astounded that we were doing that, but he was working with Sun Ra, and so were we, who was another astounding person, right? And there's this guy, this scholar at Columbia, oh God, what is his name? Rod, I remember his name. Anyway, he wrote an essay on Sun Ra and Umbra that was published in this magazine that Nate Mackey published. Anyway, he thought he was surprised that Sun Ra would be hanging out with Umbra. But, you know, but I said, but that just pointed out how not ignorant the scholar was, but how ill-informed he was, because he didn't know the scene that, well, because everybody hung out together in the East Side, man, you know. That wasn't, people didn't, and the thing was that we had with Umbra was that some of the black nationalists in the Civil thought that we was wrong for, you know, being interracial, having interracial relationships. But he said, well, man, that ain't none of your business what we do, because, you know, you do your thing, and we don't complain about that. But down here, you know, people do their own thing, and there were couples down here and people who, you know, who were married to each other. It wasn't like everybody was an interracial relationship, you know. But people made up their own minds who their friends were and how they wanted to, you know. So Umbra was kind of one of those things, you know. We had a workshop where we had some gay people in the workshop. We had some women in the workshop, different ages. Lorenzo Thomas was still in high school, you know, and but he became one of the really important members. He wrote a lot of really important books in him, and he graduated from college, and you know, and went to Saigon. He went to Vietnam. He volunteered, but he was from Panama, so he has all these experiences. And the next thing we're going to do, publish with Umbra, is going to have one of his stories in there. So Umbra got known for having a workshop where we had honest criticism, because, you know, it don't do you no good people praise your stuff and it, you know, and it ain't worth praising. I mean, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help your work. So that's what we were. So some people had a tough time, but everyone could deal with it once it was established. People could deal with it, and it helped everybody's writing to have honest critiques of their work. It really helped. So the person who put it all together was a guy named Tom Dent. He was from New Orleans, and his father was the head of Dillard University. So Tom was like a great organizer. In fact, he was working for the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund. And the Legal Defense Fund is where we typed up the first issue of our magazine, After Hours. And so we were very close to SCLC, people in SNCC and CORE and stuff, and we considered that to be part of our writing thing. So in the preface to our first magazine, we said that we believe that people, you know, should write about social issues, you know. And at the time, and it seems that it's going back to the time that it was, there used to be only academic poetry, or poetry from the Western tradition, so to speak. We only had Gwendolyn Brooks, but we also had the people from the Harlem Renaissance. So one of our benefactors was Langston Hughes, who gave us his mailing list and came down and hung out with us and invited us up to his pad up in Harlem, and he was great. He was great, and I hate to see him now maligned in some ways that he would have objected to if he was alive, but I'm not even going to go into it, but he was a wonderful person. And I have a photograph in my studio of Langston Hughes standing in the south of Spain, during the Spanish Civil War, with Ernest Hemingway, Garcia Lorca, and Nicolas Guillen, who was a great poet laureate of Cuba. So, you know, he was great. So Langston helped us out a lot. And we put on parties. And this is something that we put on parties at the Advance, which was a leftist group down on Clinton Street, which was down towards the Williamsburg Bridge, way deep in the Lower East Side, right? And we used to have Archie Shepherd play, Cecil Taylor would play, and this guy, William, what's his name? Not William Parker, but
Bill Dixon.
Bill Dixon. And the thing is that people would dance. And these guys were playing improvised. People would dance anyway, man. So I thought that was like really great, you know. But we had a good time at these parties, you know, and everybody was pretty much open to everybody else. But of course, this was before the Summer of Love and before things started really going, and the civil rights movement got hot, and people started getting assassinated. And the one thing that started the civil rights, the black arts for us was Amiri, who we worshipped, and we always considered him to be like in a high echelon, but he was such a brilliant guy, except that he always called black people Negro. And we would laugh because we said, you know, we're not even going to be no more Negro. We cut that out. We said, we black. And people used to get so angry, and they'd invite us out to the suburbs, and sometimes we get thrown out because people say about this black thing, right? But it worked. It stuck, and it worked. And that was a great thing. But Amiri, we respected him so much, and at some point he just came and said, look, and some of the people in Umbra had been in different groups that he was in, with Angry Young Men or
Organization of Young Men.
Right, he was in that with Joe Johnson, who just passed, bless his soul, and Calvin Hicks, who was a brilliant guy, and he wasn't in the group, his wife was, but he was part of the group, so we never thought of the group as being just a group of people and that's it. People in our periphery, in our community, and whoever wanted to come to the workshop could come, you know.
Right.
So, but after Malcolm got killed, it was a whole nother story.
Yeah.
And that's when Amiri came to us and said he wanted us to help him raise money. So we had these poetry readings in the village and stuff, and raised this money, and then we went uptown to help him build the theater. And Joe Overstreet, who still has a gallery on Ken Caliber down here, and he hasn't been well lately, but he's hoping to get better, built the theater for them. Right. Sun Ra would come and lecture the musicians on them and play for them. We had poetry workshops. We'd come up there and read and celebrate and do whatever we could do. So it was never, and some people thought that Amiri should have been, I don't know what they thought he should be, but he was always who he was. You know what I'm saying? He didn't nobody tell him around, but he was always a very gentle, polite guy, man, and very brilliant. And I have to say, later on, I had the pleasure, man, of having Amiri as a department chairman at Stony Brook.
I remember
when we finally got into academia, which came about just after Umbra, you know, as Umbra was coming on, I think City College and other things, they realized that they had something to educate people with because they didn't know nothing about black culture. Right. And the people in Harlem, John Henry Clark and all the scholars had done their own thing. And they had put it together and had their own way they had their own curriculum. And so it wasn't no big deal for people to just go right onto them. And John Henry Clark, as I understand it, got his GED when he was being appointed chairman of the Hunter College African American Studies, you know. So that just goes to show you that. So that's enough of that, but, you know, I could go on and on about that time, that period.
Professor Harris, I see you writing a lot. I'd love to hear if you have any responses or if what Dr. Henderson said brought up anything for you.
I write because I'm a scholar and I just try to gather this information and it's in the period that I work on. Something I'm very, Two things. One thing, I think it's great how you have just shown that things don't break up neatly, that people that interacted, whether you were Umbra or whether you were Black Arts, that people really interacted. And another thing that many people who didn't know Mary and who just, first of all, they imagine him very tall. Right. And that he's this wild, angry man. But he was incredibly warm. And I just love that people, like you and other people, just to talk about the person he was. And he was very gentle, and he could be personally very quiet. Then there was the very dramatic person on stage. And I didn't know that he was fixated on the word Negro before. For a moment, right. But I want to say, something that's great about this whole event is I heard people who were there, who were on the Lower East Side, who were in our Harlem when Baraka was in Harlem, and can talk about it, and similar experiences elsewhere. But I'm just trying to get the facts down. That's all.
There's a.
We need to get them down too. Because
Absolutely.
That's right.
They'll steal that, The bandits will steal that too,
Right.
and distort it if they can. And I don't know why they do that, but they do.
There's some examples of what's being discussed right now in book and vinyl form, and I wanted to know what led to the formation of these particular artifacts, starting a discussion about Black Fire began with a topic that Althea brought up a couple of minutes ago. And Mr. Henderson, I wanted to know, you were one of the artists that he contacted to be part of this, as well as Mr. Anderson. How did that come to be? And also this recording here, which I believe is like a couple years later, 70-71, with your excellent poem on that recording.
That was a benefit at I think the Apollo, right?
Yeah.
And that was a benefit at the Apollo, and I think it was for the civil rights thing. And then Mary put that together, and I think Random House was involved. But Black Fire, it pointed out Larry Neal. Larry was one of the people who we always could have contact with, because Larry was up in Harlem. He was a black nationalist, quote unquote, as they would say, but he was always open, and we could always talk with Larry. Some people couldn't talk to because they were mad at you. It was, man. And we'd laugh, but we wouldn't laugh in their face. See, we'd laugh later. But there were people very serious about that, and they believed that only black people should be with black people and all this. And you could believe that for a while. I think well, anyway, that's a whole other story. But Larry put together Black Fire with Emiri, and then this guy from Black Classic Press republished the book, right. And it's a beautiful replica.
It is.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Yeah. The other person in this period is Woody King.
Right. Oh, wow.
Woody King is the link between drama, poetry, music, and so forth, with the Henry Street Settlement Theater, right? And way back in developing the plays there. And one of the things that Woody King did was, this Black Spirits was a collaboration with Motown. Woody also had a collaboration with Motown at the Apollo, where a large number of poets performed, and he had created a 2-volume album with Motown on the Black poets at the Apollo.
Black Forum Records.
Excuse me?
Black Forum Records.
Black Forum Records, yeah, at the Apollo. And for some reason, I don't remember the specifics, but you know how capitalism works. The albums were never promoted by Motown. And I remember we were living on 147th Street off of St. Nicholas, and Woody was around the corner on Convent Avenue. And I would go to his house, and he would have these stacks of, of albums, you know, 2 volumes. It was just difficult for him to promote it. He didn't have a body of people to go out and promote the albums. You know, they're not that easy when you're on the street with albums, because when you have 100 albums, it's kind of heavy, right, you know, in those days. So a lot of that stuff is lost. I was one of the performers on that, and I think I have one of the 2 volumes albums left. I have to ask Woody if he had any others. We had, one of the things that looking back over the 50, almost 60 years, is that a lot of stuff that you took for granted that'll be around forever, gone, right? Like these albums, books, gone. You go out of print and you lose a copy, it's gone. And I think it's important in the 21st century to realize that a lot of information from the mid to late 20th century has been lost. The physical information has been lost, and that it's extremely important for those of us who are still alive to document certain things. I was talking to Brother Warren about our old Westbury experience. That has to be documented for those of us who are still around, because that was one of the unique 4-year institutions in America and the world, where mainly young scholars, black, white, Latino, Asians, were able to create a 4-year institution from scratch, and to raise basic questions. Why departments? Why is there 1970? Why is there a demand for black studies and a demand for Latino studies and a demand for women's studies? Why? Right? And we don't have to do that. We're starting from scratch. So we talked about integrating that. Why, you know, why departments? What was the political reason for departments? We didn't have departments. We had areas of interest, so to speak. And that made, what that did was it made the whole music scene with the students, in reference to the students, understand that if you're going into music, but you're also going, the music is impacting and influenced by all these other areas,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
All these other areas were impacted on your music, and music was impacted on all these other areas. And this was the elan of the university, of the college at that point. And it was so important, and that we, the faculty and the students, understood that there was this interrelationship, right? This dialectical relationship between the different areas of study. And for some of the young people, it was like absolutely mind-blowing, right? Absolutely, you know, it's like, what? You know, relationship between math and music, you know, or chemistry and music, you know, it's like, okay. So I right, and Ken McIntyre. Yes, yeah, but Ken McIntyre was the anchor, one of the cultural anchors in the whole development of that. Not only that, but the feminist press has its foundation at Old Westbury, right? You had the feminist press and the feminist movement there. We had dormitories that were open to couples, and we did not define what a couple was. It could be male, female, the daycare center, exactly. This, absolutely 1970, mind-blowing, right? And the impact on the students was profound, right? Very profound, because one of the most unique things that happened at Old Westbury was in that roughly 10-year period, 1970 and 1980, a 10-year period of that incarnation of Old Westbury as a progressive school, there were no racial incidences. Even when, you may not know this, McGuire, the president, cracker from Georgia, tried to recruit what he thought was your typical all-American racist white boy to spy on everybody else, right? This is, the white guy was a Vietnam vet, crew cut, so forth. And he came to one of our meetings, and he said, do you know what President McGuire wanted to do? You know, he wanted me to spy on us. You know, and it was like, okay. You know, it was a very unique experience. But all I'm saying is that when we look at the young musicians that came through Old Westbury, including Craig Harris and a number of others,
Noel Scott.
Right, Noel Scott. They had a intellectual and spiritual and cultural experience that could not be found anywhere. And that anywhere else, and that deeply is impressed in their work, in their continual work.
Would you like to follow up on that one?
Well, it's just that to have an opportunity like that, it would really be impossible to mess it up entirely, you know, because, I mean, there was so much energy. I mean, all these, I thought this was a madman. You know, he's not somebody what was it? 30, 40 years ago, you know, and to see somebody that,
50 now.
yeah, okay, but, you know, afros weren't popular then, you know, and we both had one, you know, but all these kinds of things, you know, they were people that you would not trifle with on just any basis, you know. It was like we were serious folks. You know, I mean, it was like the attitude was there that we have a chance to really do something without all the interference that was holding us back in all of our other jobs. You know, everywhere I went, I had problems. You know, they would, oh, you're too close to your students. Or there would be some separation that they would want that those of us who came out there didn't feel the need for. And so we were able to integrate so completely in terms of faculty and students, and for the most part, the administration, you know, that the administrators were there more or less to keep the lid on, I think, more than anything else. You know, they couldn't interfere with what we were doing. It's the first time in my life that I went to teach, and somebody said, we want you to teach this subject, but how are you going to do it? You know, and I didn't have to look into the old books where I had to pick out the old folks back home and this and that, you know what I mean, all those old, you know. So I got rid of all that shit and began to bring in things that we felt that the students themselves were also interested in. And of course, in music, this was easy because we could bring in all the forms that we knew from our own homes, what people were interested in. And they tied into that, you know, and these people became academicians and teachers themselves in their own right. A lot of them took these ideas and, you know, they haven't gone as far universally as I would like to see them go, but I see more and more these open tendencies to honor the ideas of the people who can teach and should be teaching and expressing these ideas and exposing the students to them, you know. It made a big difference with our whole student population.
Absolutely, and to tie in with that, Mr. Henderson brought up Archie Shepp's name, and I know Professor Harris, in the earlier conversation you mentioned something about being together with both Amiri Baraka and Archie Shepp for a presentation. I bring this up to tie it in what everyone has been saying, because what's been happening now is the conjunction of education and social activity, which is all under the framework of jazz and self-determination. And Mr. Shep seems to be the embodiment of that. In past conversations with Mr. Anderson, he's brought up his name as well. And so I wanted to know.
Well, yeah, I'll use the mic. Right, when you brought up the idea about music and intellectuals in music, Archie Shep was the person who came immediately to mind. Shep comes up a lot of things. You know, he's living in the apartment that Baraka, that Baraka and Hetty are living in, and it also makes that whole argument I'm making less sharp, less clear, because something Baraka talks about. There was incredible music played in the house, and that music was played in you guys have gone. Played in Archie Shep's apartment. But something about Shep is things I thought about talking about. I was teaching in 2002 at Penn State, and I was teaching a class because I'm in the English department, and you can teach whatever you want in an English department. So I was teaching a class in free jazz. And no, by the way, the music department would not teach a course in free jazz. Right. And the course ended because we got money from students, because the university would not give us the money. It ended in a free jazz weekend, and Archie Shep was one of the people who came into play. So Baraka and Shep, Baraka, did his spoken word, and Shep, and he, and he performed. And it was just so. I mean, he's always, every minute we were with him, in conversation. He's very articulate, very political, radical political, and very outspoken. And I guess so. So he keeps coming, coming back when you think about that. And I'm also sort of, one of his first albums, he has a spoken part about Malcolm X. People maybe remember it more in detail. And I was reading about that the other day, and one reason that happened was that to get the album made, there was an arrangement that he had to do something on John Coltrane. That doesn't quite make sense. Do you remember it? Because I don't.
Yeah, Professor Harris, you might be referring to Four for Train, his first recording for Impulse, and I think the recording that you're referring to that had the Malcolm poem was Fire Music, which was a year after February 6th. No, thank you.
So I've started to say a couple things about him, but he's certainly, when we talk about and when Sam talks about musicians are political, that they're intellectual, Archie Shep is first person that comes to mind.
Archie collaborated with Amiri Baraka on Slave Ship, I think, which was really at the Negro Ensemble Theater, which was on 8th Street and 6th Avenue. But it was really a beautiful thing. They had a replica of the ship, a set, and the music was beautiful. Huh?
Yeah. I've only read about it. I've never seen it.
I hope they recorded it because it was beautiful music and it was live and it was and the play is very dramatic. It's a beautiful collaboration.
I don't think it was recorded. I saw it. I was there. I saw it. And the one evening I was there, it's very dramatic. Did you see it?
Yeah.
It was very dramatic. Where they, they were bidding. They were selling an enslaved woman, stripped her down to her waist, and a white guy in the audience, because they were doing bidding, a white guy in the audience got carried away, right? Yeah, and then they just threw the woman to him, and he grabbed her.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And at that point, he realized that he was he was in the, in the 19th century, being a typical white enslaver, right? The audience was like, some of the black folk were ready to go at him. It was a very engaging play, but I don't think the music was fantastic. I don't think it was recorded. Outside, of course, let me always say, the FBI. Okay? COINTELPRO was in full force. They had the latest technology in recording everything. So if we are able to get into the archives of the
redacted.
FBI, you'll be able to have some sound on that.
Well, you can apply for it under the Freedom of Information Act, right?
Right, some of it you can. For example, my uncle worked for ABC. He was a cameraman, worked for ABC, and Malcolm X met him and said, I want you to be my camera person when I have the press and so forth, right? And so my uncle used ABC camera equipment. He could not get access to those, to the films that he, recorded of Malcolm. Later, Gil Noble tried to get access. He's in ABC with Like It Is. Gil said he went into ABC archives because he knew that my uncle had these documents, these film documents, interview of Malcolm. He could not get access to it.
Were they there? Did he see? Did he find them?
He knew they were there. He could not get access to them.
So he couldn't even look at them.
No, not even with Freedom of Information. He could not look at them. Nothing. And that's how deep it was.
Yeah, and yeah. Hold on.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yep, absolutely.
Well, there was a film, a recent thing called Soul. They did the Ellis Hazlitt, who had a show called Soul.
Soul, yeah.
His niece, who he brought up, made a film.
Right.
That came out, and she had all kind of trips. She couldn't find a lot of the shows because they destroyed a lot of the shows, and she found some, but and she looked for 10 years.
Yeah.
So I guess they're gone.
In reference to that, did you want to ask something out there? Okay. And in reference to that conjunction artistically about what was happening with the literary scene and the jazz scene in conjunction with the educational scene, what was that connection about at that time period between the jazz musicians and the writers, and how that eventually broadened into education?
Well, almost all the poets had at least one thing, like a recording or something where they're reading a poem, and the free jazz is playing behind them, or in some cases, structured, or arranged jazz. I did some things with Don Moyer. Well, this went to, by the way, Joseph Jarman had a thing at Roulette. They had a tribute to him, and Threadgill. No, we're not talking about Threadgill. Threadgill.
Henry
Threadgill, at Roulette,
Yeah.
And
Is he still alive? Am I thinking?
Yes.
Okay, no. Then I'm
Joseph
getting
Jarman
him
passed.
mixed
He
up
just
with
had a memorial.
Yeah, but he was there, and he had a woman playing organ, and it was just wonderful. But he did. There was all these collaborations, and I don't know whether, but I know I have some. I'll have some in my archive, and I think almost a whole lot of poets do, a whole lot of writers do. I believe.
When you say your archive, is it your personal one, or is it at a university, or both?
I want to speak to that because we're working on that now, and we're trying to figure it out because, for one thing, it's a vast field, but one thing we have discovered, I don't think any black people know a lot about this, because we were just talking about David Hammond's who's a visual artist, had a, oh God, what do you call that thing? It's like some kind of thing that poets.
He was making snowballs and stuff.
No, it was no. It was a chain. It's called a name of a dead person. I forgot.
Oh, I know you. Right.
Huh? No shit. Anyway, wait a minute. But we helped Ted to sell his papers to the University of California, and I think he made them. We also were trying to find Bob Kaufman stuff. But basically, I think what we're trying to do is to have a place where people can donate their papers, because a lot of artists die, and their parents or relatives don't know what to do with the stuff that they have. Right. So we did a thing I was at City College for about 7 years. It's amazing. In the Graduate Center, working on something called the Poetics. I had come there to try to see what we're going to do about archives and get groups together.
Lost and Found?
Excuse me?
Tied up with Lost and Found?
Well, Lost and Found is pretty much concentrating on the white avant-garde and the scholarly poets, which of course that's where but they have done some wonderful things with June Jordan, Audre Lorde.
I think they did the Ted Jones thing too, I think.
Right, they have done some very, very nice stuff with Audre Lorde, and June Jordan wrote some beautiful journals. Because we were working with the kids in the SEEK program, working with high school kids, helping them to learn to write, which is a very successful program. And all them kids who wanted to rhyme, some of the white people in the program said, no, they didn't want them to rhyme. They said, no, we don't want you to rhyme because that's not modern poetry. But the black people said, no, yo, go ahead. You want to rhyme, you go on and rhyme, And of course, then hip-hop came in. And they did pretty good with them rhyme, I'm telling you, man. But we're still trying to figure out how to deal with the archive. And I think that I've been working with some people from New York with the Umbra archive, trying to keep that alive and to have as complete an Umbra archive as possible and to keep it intact in some way and to find a house for it. So we went to NYU. I'm going to go visit the Beinecke at Yale, they have the most black stuff. Yeah. And they are, most people can't get in these places. Right. And NYU, you can't really get in. So we want to have something that's more open. Now, the Schomburg is very good, but they're very crowded also, and it's uptown. And our thing was downtown. So we're trying to work it out and also trying to figure out how much things are really worth. Because what we have found is that the people won't tell us. And how much is worth to the institution. They'll tell you how much they'll pay you for it, but that doesn't mean how much it's worth. But in terms of Yale, has a big endowment. I think that their endowment, some of it is based on the worth of their archives.
Yeah. I'd just like to say that I was a member of an organization that got together to produce their own records during the early 70s and the early 80s. It was called, the label was called Strata East. All right? Now, Strata Records was born in Detroit, Michigan. All right? And it was an all-black label. There were a few other examples of that, but very short, But what happened was a bunch of us in New York City got together and performed Strata East, which again, it wasn't so much that it was an all-black label as it was a label of independent producers. Most of us happened to be black. And we got this whole label together, and we're selling our records, merchandising ourselves. I was responsible for manufacturing my own. I had to find a company to do that. And there are some examples here. Very recently, this year, somebody called me up to ask if I had any Strata East records. And I had a number of them from other, artists and whatnot. But these individual LPs are now selling on the market for $100 a copy, each record, And it's still hard for us to market this and get it out to the people who are looking for it and want to buy it. You have to and I'm not that good on the computer because I'm, I was old before the computer got here. So I never took it so seriously. I have trouble remembering my damn cell phone. But see, these things are going to be valuable, but there are a few people who have copies available. And there are people, what do you call them, collectors, who are looking for anyone who has a single copy of one of these records. They can get $100 very fast for it, and probably more so if you want to do that. But that's what it's developed onto, and still there's no effort to republish these records and get them out so that the original artists themselves can enjoy the profits that might come from that sort of exposure.
Yeah, I think that it raises the issue of what is one of the demands out of reparations in this country. And one of the demands of reparations is archiving and collecting the black arts, the whole series of genres that are there. And people, as you heard, struggling to find some place in New York City to archive this material, this valuable material that was the foundation to contemporary music post Vietnam War period. Very, very valuable. A demand in reparations would be that you set aside, the federal government set aside, a few $1 billion to begin to archive the works of musicians and artists of African descent.
Is it happening now?
No, I'm saying.
Oh, yeah, that it should.
Yeah, it should.
Oh,
Yeah,
my
that's
goodness,
it.
Something.
Should. I mean, that's what we have to organize. We got to do that.
Here we go. Here we go.
Right. Right.
Well,
Exactly. Exactly. One of the foundational things about the reparations demands, if you do it in an organized way, people realize that it cannot happen under capitalism. It cannot. In no way in the world. It'll bankrupt the capitalist society. So the reparations demands are part of a revolutionary development in the society that says, if you want all of these things to happen, you have to end the capitalist system in all of its forms. You're absolutely right. This is it.
Well, but the thing is, though, that I think that if we really want it, we're not going to be able to use that kind of language and that kind of angle on it. I mean, but we should figure something out, right? Or compromise on something that can unite everyone to go after this stuff, because what we do is want it. For instance, NYU is tearing down half of Lower Manhattan.
Exactly.
We could get a building from them. They could easily give us a building and retrofit it to start an archive. I think we can actually get an archive because they are worth a lot. And I think that almost on their worth alone, we could start something.
Yeah. Let me interject. Have you ever heard of a period called the loft scene? Yeah, this. I mean, and I was a part of this.
Just about to ask you about
a whole bunch of people found these empty apartments or fairly unused buildings and moved in at a very low rate. I was there for 30 years, and my rent never increased more than $250 a month for this floor-through apartment. I mean, it was raggedy when I came in there, but you move in, you fix it up. And what we started doing was, first of all, rehearsing a band every week. So I had this group of guys together every Thursday afternoon or whatever it was. We'd start rehearsing, and then other things started happening. I wasn't the only one that was doing this, by the way. Juma Sultan had Studio We, and I had Studio Wis, and he is still active. But so many of the people with these apartments it created what they called the loft scene, where for about 20 years you could rotate into different old apartments that had a studio that someone had utilized and was presenting music, theater, and dance, you know. And this went on. It was all out of our own pockets. You know, we were all financing these things ourselves, but there was enough activity that you could keep it going if you loved it enough, which is what went on for about 30 or 40 years. We went down and lobbied for the government to start an arts program that would help us finance these musicians. And that only worked up to a point. It didn't get very far. You know, they have an arts, you know, but you know it's not going to get any farther this next couple of 3 years until we can make some adjustments with our government.
Well, why don't we deposit it in our own paper so we can have some record of this stuff? Both of you, this is very important stuff you're working with. How come we don't, we can't
many of us
benefit by
still
it?
have it, but see, when somebody dies and their family doesn't have any money and they're responsible for an archive, the archive goes to, you know.
On that level.
If it goes to one of the big universities, we may never see it again or have access
Are
to
you
it.
kidding? Or it gets thrown away. One of the programs I did at NYU, at CUNY, was with the Bush, Camille Billups and the James Hatch, the Hatch Billups collection, and Danny Dawson, who was the first photo for that, James Van der Zee curator at the Studio Museum. And so what happened was, Camille said that half of his stuff would have been thrown away if they didn't rescue it. She rescued it. She said there are other people who we never heard of whose all of that stuff is gone. Yeah. And then there was this guy who had the African American Wax Museum. Right. And we were pointing to him because they destroyed all of his stuff. And this was renowned around the world. Yeah. So in other words, we couldn't even protect our own stuff. Right. So we got to be able to do something about this. I mean, this is an emergency, and that's kind of what I'm saying, is that we're at a point now, it's very crucial now. We have to actually produce stuff. We have to actually make things happen.
Well, you have to also know that the largest export from America to Europe happens to be this particular kind of music.
No kidding.
It's the largest export out of this country.
How come we don't know that?
And you were close to Max Roach, Mr. Smith. So how does Max Roach fit into that? Before we open it up in a few minutes to the audience, but I'm sorry, but how does Max Roach figure into all of that? Because I forgot to bring him up in the topic, and you were close to him. And the topic, this particular component of the discussion, is reminded me of.
Well,
like hip hop and jazz, I think. Right?
Well, the thing is, see, Max Roach was a very strong person, you know, and there were a lot of people beside Max Roach. Some of them, I sat at a table once with Max Roach and Art Blakey and Kenny Clark, who was older than Max and Art Blakey, and Max was somebody that we revered as God, but these two older gentlemen than him were slapping him up beside his head and joking with him, and he was, oh, shucks, fellas, you know. But and he could have done that to me very easily if he had had that disposition, because that's the way I regarded him. But it just shows you that this hierarchy comes, and when people are deceased, I don't know how much, I've been to clubs in Japan and looked up on a shelf, you know, like this long for 3 floors, and all you see is recorded music from American musicians. Jazz. That was, and yeah, well, they call it jazz if you want to. You know, I call it African American classical music.
You already made it.
But it's all over the world and acknowledged as such, except that the people who produce the music aren't getting any benefit from it.
Well, why don't we publicize that? There should be some kind of organization. Juma, who I know, and we tried to help him sell his collection, which was unique, and we didn't know anyone who could advise him. And we finally found an attorney, but it was too late. We found one of the best attorneys in the world in LA who would have done it, you know, quid pro quo. But the thing is that we don't have any knowledge or information about this stuff. So what are we going to do?
I think it's a matter of communication. I mean, I knew about it through research and through other people's information, you know, and because I'm involved in the business itself. But one person like me can't do much. I mean, I could do more probably. But, you know, when you've got other things to worry about, raising a family yourself, and you know, there's only so much that one individual can do. We need a unification of effort.
I think that there's the African American History Museum in D.C.
The Smithsonian, you mean?
That's affiliated to the Smithsonian, but it's its own separate entity that I think we need to have a organized presentation to that board of trustees there about archiving, you know, American classical music, right? Doing, you know, because they have money, and money begets money. You know, they can get money. That's one.
Well, there's the Jazz Foundation also.
Well, yeah, that's a jazz, but this is an entity that already has set a precedent in archiving material. Okay. Right. The other is the African American Library in Fort Lauderdale. It's the Schaumburg of the South.
Florida.
Okay, and their archives, their archivists are looking to do things around, you know, archiving Black cultural material. And then also in the Miami area is the Dillard High School. Dillard High School produced a large number of jazz musicians in the 40s and 50s and out of that. And they also have a museum.
In Florida?
In Florida,
But
in Miami.
Dillard was from New Orleans, right?
Excuse me?
Dillard was in New Orleans, right?
Well, yeah, there was a Dillard in New Orleans, too.
But this is something else.
Yeah, this is, you know, the Dillard is, I guess, one of the white philanthropical people who came during Reconstruction, give money to folk to get educational thing. So, yeah, so those are three things that I know that we can begin to address in a very formal way. They have resources, they have financial resources, they have the space, you know, for the archival material, and most importantly, they have the expertise there to work it through.
But this is a great field to get some expertise in because it can provide jobs, but also it's about wealth. I mean, this stuff is very valuable, and we can't even hardly find out how much it's worth, which is, I think, astounding.
Yeah. Should we open up for a Q&A? What are you saying? Go ahead. You want me to talk about this question?
Yeah, before we lead into we're going to go right into the Q&A, but Althea is also the person chairing this panel discussion, and you have experience in
I've
archiving.
done quite a bit of work in archives. It's a tremendously complicated question, of which you guys have brought up a lot of the issues. I think one trouble is that once you have an archive, like, blessed be if it's all in good shape to actually preserve these things well, but then how do you actually get them accessible to the communities to which they should be most important? And I think you bring up this really wonderful point about it being connected to reparations. That is an essential, I think that is sort of, would be the horizon of thinking about making it accessible and doing real deep cultural work, but that's going to take a larger consciousness around the ways in which Black bodies and labor were used in the constitution of capital. And therefore, what does this art mean in that picture, right? That's going to be basically, in my view, when we have those archives. It's when that consciousness is developed that those archives are going to do the best work that they can do. Right now, unfortunately, I've worked with a few different artists on archives, on building archives, of working with institutions. Yeah, there is some infrastructure, but again, I don't think it's honoring the material as well as it could because of this greater issue, right? I think probably the most promising archive at the moment is digitization. I think getting the stuff in a form where it will be as accessible as possible available to everyone is, it's an incredible democratizing force to digitize. And there are some people who are doing great work in that. Roz is one of them. So that would be my recommendation to anyone, is to digitize their material, especially you, Warren.
But can you get more specific on that? Because,
Yeah.
first of all, digitization it's in real time.
Yeah.
So that means that if you have your own funky cassette player and you want to digitize it,
Yeah.
well, it's a serious operation. Then what do you do with it once you have digitized it? What do you do with
Right.
it then?
So it really depends on what your goals are with the material. In Warren's case, if his hope is to get these records to more people, get them to be more accessible, obviously a reprinting of the vinyl would be ideal. But if you're going the digitization route, setting up a platform with which people can give at least donations to listen to the material. I also think there are a number of digital archives. The Association for Cultural Equity does a really great job coding all the digital material that they have. But that then does go into the hands of someone else, right? So, but once you code it, then it does become that if someone searches for something, they'll be able to bring that material up from a search engine.
And who owns it then?
I mean, the internet's really tricky, so my mom's an IP lawyer.
This is complicated.
So technically, if you digitize it and you make it available on the web, you are the owner of that intellectual property, absolutely. Whether, in effect, you are an owner of that intellectual property is a different question. And I think that's where digitization becomes tricky and where your goals of an archive become important. The reality is, as soon as you digitize something, some young DJ is going to use it and not reference it and take advantage, and it will be, these cycles are actually really horrendous. And I think there are a lot of young musicians today who are not being conscious about where they're taking music from, and I think it's a huge issue. So it really depends on your goal.
So you're saying that digitization means that it's available on the internet?
Ideally, you could digitize it and not put it on the internet.
Well, that's your option, I think.
And then you could just save it until then it's there forever. And as long as there are people who always know it's there, right? You don't have to worry about keeping a climate-controlled room for vinyls in the same way, right?
But it's inaccessible.
I mean, there are all sorts of ways to digitize something.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of manners. Yeah, I mean, again, it's minefield after minefield, to be honest.
This is complex stuff,
It's
though.
very complex, but that would be my recommendation to anyone who has an extensive archive, is to work on digitization. Yeah.
Well,
You don't have to put it on hard drive. You don't have to have them on hard drive. You don't have to have them on tape.
What kind of tape? Reel to reel?
Yeah, and these are all, what you said is very important. When you worked with the Alan Lomax archive, did you notice any kind of, sociological differences, if it matters or not, about how that particular archive was handled, as opposed to, even though it's an important component of Black history and culture, but just as far as the ownership issues, as opposed to the archives that are residing with Black artists.
The Association for Cultural Equity remains a very open platform. They welcome people into their archives. It's a very rare case. They have all of Lomax's work and everything that was ever given to him, which is about 70% of the material there. And they have stuff that you can, that if you go to the Smithsonian, you have to buy it, but you could go to their website and listen to it for free. And they work with communities, trying to get it back into the communities, and also trying to get money when there's some commercial element to the use of a recording. But to be honest, this comes back to issues of archives. They're very much understaffed. They're housed at Hunter College at the moment. And I think, at Columbia, where I'm at the moment, we have the Laura Bolton archive. First recordings of the instrument I play ever are housed there, and all sorts of different geographical regions represented. Horribly problematic history of that archive, and then getting it there's been a researcher there very much involved in repatriating it to Native communities in this country, and that being tremendously difficult. And the question of how we value these things, how valuable are they when they sit dead for centuries? I mean, not centuries, but for decades without anyone having access, and then we try to re-release them, right? So I think the core, it's great to archive material, but I think you need to find people who have the same goals as you in using that material, in making that material accessible and preserving it. And I think that's tremendously tricky. And still, it's still something in which the laws around it, how ownership works, has yet to be kind of really figured out. And frankly, there's a lot to be figured out with material of people who have since passed. And I think that's a major issue. Yeah, please.
We're doing this now. I did a program with Bob Kaufman, a documentary, 2 hours. And we're trying to let Poets House use it. But in their agreement, they want to use it into perpetuity. So I'm saying, okay, now what the heck, what do we want to do? What are we talking about? But that's what a lot of the contracts now are into perpetuity. So what do we, this is crazy. We have to figure this out some kind of way.
Yeah.
Now you have something at Columbia. They had a manuscript of Claude McKay, the Harlem Renaissance novelist from the West Indies. It was, after almost 100 years, it was finally republished, but they went through 8 years in the courts, apparently, about, I don't understand what was wrong, because they had this stuff in their archive. They must have had some kind of permission. What was the problem that took 8 years before it was published? It's finally published, and I have that novel. But
property under capitalism is central to capitalism. The property laws evolved from the enslavement of African people. The whole concept of mortgaging came out of the early stages of capitalism, and mortgaging on enslaved people. And the laws that developed became complex and convoluting because of the reality of humans as property, okay? So once that human being was considered no longer property, the laws remained. And the question of intellectual rights, the rights of what you produce in your brain under capitalism, who owns it, is defined by the capitalist system, not by the human being, okay? And so that's what makes it complicated, right? In a socialist society, your intellectual developments is collectively owned and respected. And you get compensated for that. In a capitalist society, what comes out of your brain has a price on it. Just like the body under slavery had a price on it. And so that's where the dilemma is in 2019 in the United States in terms of property, intellectual property laws. It's very complicated. And so if a good lawyer for the sake of the people, right, would work that whole property law thing, manipulate that for the benefit of the people. And most intellectual property lawyers are not about that. Okay, that's our challenge. If we had progressive, anti-capitalist, intellectual property lawyers, we'd be able to push things to another level in terms of the jazz musicians' archival material, the Black poets' archival material, all of that. As far as I know, we don't have that. That's something that we have to develop.
Well, no, my daughter graduated.
But he wants to get to the audience.
And we're going to lead right into the group discussion after.
My daughter went to graduate from law school at Georgetown. There were 500 people graduated. 20 were in non-corporate,
Right,
law.
nonprofit,
That would take this
Right.
kind of thing on.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment. I found out through personal inquiries that to have your archives evaluated might take around $4,000 to $6,000 just for the evaluation. To have somebody who's qualified to do that.
You claim to be qualified.
Well, if any of you are interested, I know Sarah Sully will happily speak to you about this, and she is a part of the movement, and she will answer your questions. I'll give you her contact. Well, she, supporting Black art and honoring it and doing right by it. I'll give it to you perhaps after. Absolutely. Sarah Sully, for anyone who wants to know, but I'll be happy to give you her. It's just her.
Yeah.
One
And
woman
we're
show.
going to, absolutely. Did you have another question, all three? Okay. We're going to lead into our Q&A portion or group conversation right now. And Darryl, did you want to say something about archives, man? Because you mentioned something about Max Roach and stuff, right? Does anybody?
Give him the mic.
Yeah, actually, I guess we might have talked about this recently. This is so much related to everything that you're all saying, and I'm really appreciating everything that you've all been sharing, all the wisdom and information and things about the struggle for creating these archives and the significance of it. Last summer, I got a text from someone, some of you may know Ben Young, he used to be involved at WKCR, that there was a pile of Max Roach tapes sitting on the curb on President Street and 4th Avenue, where I happened to be right over there. And literally in the garbage, like there was, empty beer cans and, all kinds of discarded stuff. So I went over there and I grabbed as much as I could. And, it's sitting in my basement right now just because I haven't had time to really go through it and, do right by it. Was it not a couple of reel-to-reels, but a lot of cassette, DAT, CD, a lot of live stuff from the 80s, M-Boom stuff. And yeah, so I mean, this question of like putting resources into creating these archives, into restoring things and saving things, and then what the goal actually is, which I think is so key, is that like, I'd be interested in hearing, some of the folks who have these materials, like what are your goals with these materials? Is it to like preserve knowledge, and or is it, or maybe in tandem with that, to like make sure that this information gets passed on? And another thing I was just thinking of, not too long ago, I saw someone share a screenshot of an eBay listing of a record, the Black Unity Trio. I think do you have that record? Yeah, for going for like over like $1,000 on eBay. Some collectors getting that money, not the artists. Right. This question of cultural ownership, I think, is just so important when in these conversations, and I really appreciate how you all been addressing that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the record he referred to was an example of free jazz in Cleveland from 1968. Yusef Mumeen, alto saxophone player, used to be called Joe Phillips, and Abdul Wadud's first record when he was still Ron Devon. And is there any other?
I have a question. Actually, I have a question for you. I just wanted to say that the phrase that I'm going to carry with me today is a phrase Sam Anderson said. I believe it. You said that the creators of the music were were intellectual warriors. Did you use the word warriors? Good, because that's what
Yeah.
I thought I heard you say.
Yeah.
And that phrase to me means a lot because it, especially in the light of our American history, where the intellectual prowess of Black people were downgraded. And so that's very important for us to keep in mind, and I'll keep that with me because it helps me understand who these creators were and what their primary force was. Oh, in terms of, David, in terms of Umbra, I wanted to know whether or not, what kind of critiques that you had of music in Umbra, and what kind of tone did they take on, or what were they saying? What were they basically saying?
In the music?
Yeah, about people writing about the music of the time, and what were there articles about?
No, it was
But-
literary magazine. And then we did anthologies. We did 3 anthologies that we're going to reprint. And we didn't write a lot about music, but of course, Amiri did. And right, and the thing is that that's what's needed now. I don't see any serious music commentaries done. And I still don't understand, after going to the Vision Festival meetings, why William Parker, they talk about improvising as being some kind of religious experience. And I don't quite understand what they're talking about, and they don't seem to be able to explain it. Man, well, somebody would answer that question because, forget about it. But, I just wanted to interject. But we're thinking about, and I'm being very uncool about it, but I think that what we need to do is actually create institutions of education whose endowment are the archives.
Yeah.
Because they have a value that, and I'm telling you, one of the reasons I was at CUNY in the Graduate Center, and we had all these meetings with people involved, and Hunter College has a good Puerto Rican archive, and we had people talking, we had some of the archivists, some of the people who make money there, they wouldn't answer this question, which is how much is this stuff worth to the institution? Not how much they're willing to pay us, which is very little, but the actual worth they would not say. And I asked them point blank about 3 times. So I think that this is the secret. The experience I had in California with the archivists would lend me even to believe that more, because I know that they valued certain archives very low. And I don't think that is the actual value of them. So anyway, so I think that we need to actually create institutions that have an endowment, and some of that endowment can be the worth of that archive, which I think is higher than they tell us.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I want to, I guess, first of all, thank the speakers for the many of the insights. Just wanted to bring in, I guess, an international perspective to all this. I was born in the city of Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, and one of the things that I know about jazz growing up is that it was the music that was prohibited in the Soviet Union because of the capitalist roots of the music. Now, having listened to you and having known, having learned many things, and from this conversation, I realized that this is a music born of the struggle, music with a lot of political and racial undertones and so on and so forth that has come as a form of political and musical expression. So I'm just really puzzled by this paradox. I don't know if you watched this movie called Moscow on Hudson with Robin Williams. It's a Soviet immigrant who claims asylum in the United States, and he's a jazz musician from the Soviet Union. He grew up in the Soviet Union and so forth. And one of the families that hosts him is a Black African American family, and he talks to the jazz musician, and they just transcend all like racial issues, and they just become friends. So this is like one thing that not many people in the Soviet Union knew, that it's the music of the Black consciousness and so on and so forth. The common Soviet person that was facing someone who was playing jazz in their home was sort of like you're the enemy of the people because you listen to the jazz music, which is the capitalist music. And it was so bad that people who really appreciated the music in the Soviet Union were not able to get the records that you were just showing. They were able to get the records smuggled in, and if they were seen with those records, they could face a sentence. So some of them actually smuggled them in. They actually copied them onto X-ray film. And they were able to play it in their homes. And it was interesting because some of the X-ray films was actually with the bones. So what do you think about the paradox of because I see that many of you have the insights into socialism and so forth. What do you think? Why do you think this paradox took place? That the image of the black music in the Soviet Union was seen as a capitalist thing.
That's right. Let me ask you one more question, then we'll answer them collectively. Anybody else? One more question. Hold on.
That's a kind of a heady, that's a kind of a complex question.
Yeah, might have a paradox in my head from that question, because I, as someone who grew up in New York City and had the fortune of in my teens in the 90s, had a friend whose parents had a wealth of jazz. So in my teens, I went to St. Peter's Church and got to listen to live jazz, and my sister took me to see Max Roach at Summer Stage. So like this notion of jazz for self-determination, and now I'm part of a mass movement of Filipinos fighting for their people's liberation. So like, there's so many thoughts in my head around like how arts are commodified, and jazz is something that I didn't understand, but I'm hearing from all of you, and I value everything that you guys are sharing because so many names are coming up I'm not familiar with. This notion of for who and for what, who is this music for, the ideas of digitization. So I'm just kind of wondering the notion of how do we reclaim and overthrow to a certain extent, because what you're suggesting about reparations and how do we archive African American classical music and intellectual property, like how do people's movements in the States have that be inclusive, because cultural work is like fundamental for how we don't like block out people from hearing, anti-capitalists or imperialism. Like you have to understand how do you speak to the people in the language that they know. And so in bringing them into that fold, what does that look like for us in this period of time in particular, around a lot of the anti-fascist movements that are here, and then just hearing things in like the Soviet Union and what that looked like. I think it's very interesting this time under the administration that we have and all the other global fascist like administrations. How do we keep people's culture for the people and not have it be commodified and people decide what the value is and then not tell the very people who are creating that art? I think it's a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a question, but.
Yes. That's fine.
Could I make a comment on that, please? First of all, I think that artists do not consider the commercial profits of their art. Art is something that comes from inside of us and has to be expressed, all right? And I would have been playing music. I would have chosen the instrument that I chose for whatever reasons, in spite of the fact that I didn't think that I would make a comfortable living for myself and a future family within that. It wouldn't have stopped me, and it hasn't.
But it does stop people, right?
Well, the thing is, art doesn't come about as a means of making money, in my estimation. It's something, it's another way of verbalizing my expressions, all right? I don't want to give a speech, so I'll, hit a drum or toot a horn or what, and some people get so expert at doing that becomes an entity in itself. It's consumed my whole life from the time I was 6 years old, which is now 79 years. And I never stopped wanting to play that drum and wanting to practice it and wanting to get better and better on it. And I'm at a period now where it has provided me a certain amount of commercial comforts, but in spite of all that, I had to do some other stuff to make a living, to raise a family, raise 5 girls and put them all through school and 3 different wives and put them all through school. You know what I mean? But I'm not going to stop playing music in spite of that. You understand? It's something that's not in control of me. Every night, my wife, will you stop hitting on that pillow? I mean, so, it's not a matter of, am I going to make some money? It's a matter of, this is something inside me that I've got to let out. Now, if somebody hears it and they want to pay me a little bit for that, fine. If not, I'm doing it anyway. I can't help myself.
But what about the fellow like Herb Alpert, who owns A&M Records and who did a great album of Sun Ra, but also there's a very great avant-garde musician who is the Herb Alpert Professor of Music at Cal Arts. So I mean, but I think it's not a bad thing to make money though, right? And to hire your own fellow musicians, right?
Not at all. No, that's true. That's true. That part of it, and that's, in fact, most musicians can't make music without other people to help them. Without other musicians, and certainly without the technology that now is used to expand it. So all that has to be taken into consideration. But what I'm saying is that if you have that kind of a love inside of yourself, you're not going to be able to block it off without doing serious mental damage to your own being.
That's the thing that I think the musicians out of the period of the 60s that represented here and the poets that represented here, these were committed brothers and sisters, right? Their primary, in their heads, their primary reason to be on the planet was to create this black art of various forms, including the plastic arts people. It was not commercial. The commercial part started to really impact, I think, the music and spoken word world in the early 1980s, when some white folks discovered this, and they began to promote the some of the people, right? Some of the, not all, but some. But I think true musicians in the quote-unquote jazz world, true spoken word artists in the black arts, black poetry world were not doing it for the reason of money, all right? And it was primarily for that. But getting back to, I want to do 2 things. I want to getting back to our friend from now Russia. When you were there, I mean, here's the contradiction. One of the closest allies to the Soviet Union was Cuba. Now, did they play Cuban music? If they played Cuban music, yeah.
I was too young to,
you know?
Because I know there were, one thing I noticed that I started listening to Caribbean and Cape Verdean actually music, like Cesare Bora.
Yeah.
And I found that there was a lot of intellectual property theft taking place because the Soviet pop music adopted a lot of the rhythms and melodies from
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
as well as, I'm sure, from Cuba and some Latin jazz.
Right. So,
As far as listening, actually, haven't heard that, I don't recall.
right, I mean, the Cuban music was not bad. I mean, you could get the records,
Right.
So if, it's a contradiction, if in the then Soviet Union, they are not allowing you to hear African-American classical music, i.e. jazz, you hear it in the Cuban music and, Guinea-Bissau, and the stuff that comes out of South Africa that they supported, the musicians and so forth, that was there. So, if that was true, it was a contradiction, a deep contradiction, right? The other thing I want to point out is, in terms of the reparations issue, here's an example, a very concrete example of how these things can work. The University of West Indies, whose chancellor is Hilary Beckles, earlier this year, got a 200 million pound form of reparations from the University of Glasgow. The University of Glasgow recognized that the wealth and development of the University of Glasgow came out of the slave trade, the British slave trade and British slavery and colonialism. And so what they did, Excuse me? Yeah, right, yes, yeah. They realized that, and so they worked out a deal with the University of the West Indies, with the Chancellor Hilary Beckles, because Hilary Beckles, for the past 20 some odd years, has been advocating for British, the United Kingdom, as they call it, to have some form of reparations to the University of West Indies. Make a long story short, they got 200 million pounds, right? That's well over 200 million US dollars. And the way it's going to be worked out is through cash and in-kind services. So one of the provisions in that is archival, the utilization of the technology that is at the University of Glasgow to begin to archive a lot of stuff that's within the University of West Indies, which is on many of the islands that the British had, to begin to do that,
Keep it in Glasgow?
No. That people from the Caribbean islands will learn how to do the archives, and the archival aspects will be at the respective islands, okay? That the money, it would be part of that money would be for young people from the Caribbean, either go to the University of Glasgow and learn these archival things, or the University of Glasgow people would come to the UE and do that. So all I'm saying is a precedent has been set, okay? A precedent has been set. Right. Georgetown, Columbia University, Princeton.
They just set up, the student body just voted to give more money, it's like 0.1% of their tuition towards reparations. Georgetown is doing.
And what,
Starting to happen.
that right, that's a specific thing, yeah, that's very good. But what I'm saying is that not just the archival stuff staying at Princeton or Harvard or Yale or Columbia, but work in conjunction with a historical black college where this archival thing can be stored. And those students at the HBCU can learn those archival skills. Yeah. So in other words, a precedent has been set by the University of West Indies where we can, here in the United States, present this to the different universities that have benefited from the slave trade and slavery.
And in reference to how did you access these materials to put together this reader, Professor Harris, this book, the Leroy Jones and Marie Baraka reader? Because what you just said led into that. And
Is that the Third World Press's edition, or is that
No, it's an earlier edition. That's Thundermouth.
Thunder's Mouth Press.
who? Thundermouth.
Right. They did the original one.
Thundermouth?
Yeah.
You had access to his archives through Baraka himself.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was.
Publishers Group West.
Right. Oh, yeah, what happened was I was teaching him, this was a long time ago, and everything was out of print. And I was doing everything from Xeroxes. And I called him, and he happened to be home and answered the phone. Yeah, which is just rare. And I said, I want to do a reader. And he said, great. I'm working on one now, and it'd be great if you would take over. And that's how it happened. But I've never had. I owned a lot, and you think about the personal archive, just getting older. If you keep anything, you own a lot of stuff. But anything I needed, I either got from him or I owned. But copyright was never a problem because we were working together.
One other thing I want to mention that our Filipino sister here, reminded me of Joe Patan. Right? Joe Patan, an Afro-Filipino.
Ordinary guy.
What a lot of people don't understand is the intimate relationship between Filipino people and African Americans. In the so-called Spanish-American War, did you know that at the end of the war, 10,000 black troops stayed in the Philippines? Did you know that? Young black men stayed in the Philippines, and many of them supported and worked in the independence movement in the Philippines. This is early 1900s, right? 10,000. Just, you have to wrap your head around. 10,000 young black men, right? Most of them married Filipinos.
Well,
There is a Afro-Filipino community in Pennsylvania that can trace their family lineage back to the Philippines. This is very, very significant because what that brought into the African American culture was Filipino culture, music, food, and so forth, by the thousands, and vice versa in the Philippines. Okay. One last thing about that. The first incident, one of the first incidents of fake news happened during the Spanish-American War. The New York Times posted on the front page of the New York Times that they had captured the and killed the runaway African-American soldier who was collaborating with the Filipino guerrillas, right? And they showed a picture of this white soldier holding up a head, a severed head,
Yeah.
on the front page of the New York Times,
Yeah.
right? And because white people see all black people as being the same, they just saw the head in black, but it was a negrito. A negrito is a small Afro-Filipino. Before African Americans came, there were Africans who were in the Filipino islands, and they were short people, right? So this is the head of a negrito. Now, right after World War II, the U.S. troops are going through all the various islands, and they came across some Filipinos there, and they said to the soldiers, the general is living with us. The general was the name that the Filipino revolutionaries gave to the brother who worked with them in the independence movement, right? Now, white folks said that he was killed, right? They had the picture of his head. So when they came across him, he was an older man then, obviously, and the news broke that the general was still alive, that he was never captured by the U.S. military, and so that's a great story to leave you with, because there are so many so many struggles and movements of resistance that get distorted by your corporate media and your established historians at various universities that you don't understand that there was some other things happening in the world that was much more complex and positive.
Hey, did you have something to say to answer? Warren?
Can I add something? I mean, something about like, I recently have been talking with a Japanese, I don't know if you call him American, but he was like Miles Davis filmmaker. So he loves to tell me all these stories when he was in the 50s in New York to be a filmmaker, but instead he went to all the jazz clubs in 3 a.m. in the morning. And so it's fascinating, but like I'm not allowed, I mean, I don't think he wants, I mean, I would love to video him, but he doesn't allow me to do that. I mean, he has an archive of Miles Davis tapes, you know, he's recorded through the years.
Audio or video?
Video.
Oh, okay.
And other information is, I'm sort of like the living I'm living history of the 60s and 70s from the Asian American point of view, you would say, because I knew Amaray Baraka when Lower East Side. We had our own Asian American arts cultural community organization called Basement Workshop, and when we got like $100,000 and had a Soho loft in Soho, Amaray Baraka came up. You know, we invited him for poetry, and we invited the Lower East Side poets to be there and have jazz events. And it was kind of funny how Amaray, at the time, he was passing out Mao pamphlets and all of that. That was because we happened to have a mass demonstration called Confucius Plaza, which is the tail end of the black movement, you would say, right? So, because we were trying to get workers in the construction business, and I've been able to get a documentary, access of doing a documentary entitled like Democracies in Chinatown, 1974 to 1994. But so my feeling now, because we have, out of that group, we have now a Chinese Museum of Chinese in America, and I submitted some old photos of my parents' wedding, blah, blah, it's like these kids have a job in the museum, a salary, and they can't afford to pay me for some of these old archival materials.
How would you feel? What would be your answer to that,
And
Warren?
so it's the me generation that's, you know, that I think I'm fighting now, who are getting the work, the computer jobs and everything, you know, beyond what we have.
Yeah, Warren.
Go ahead.
Oh, no.
I'm just adding on information.
PBS thing on Sean, on the Asians in the Pacific Northwest, who talk about how they established the
PBS is a bunch of lies.
wait, well, no, but this is Sean Wong and
Sean Wong, I know, recently they had this thing about No Boy and the family cannot get the rights because Penguin is
what novel is this? The one that was
No
in the
Boy,
40s?
John Okada.
That's the one that they based their.
Penguin. I mean,
Oh.
Penguin Publishing
I don't know
House
the
is
publishing
republishing
company.
it. Well, I just
Yeah.
got the email from Sean Wong.
But anyway, Lost in the Nada,
Yeah.
the Pacific
I know,
Northwest
I know.
Asians, the West Coast
Yeah, I
Asians,
know.
did all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I would think that the Basement Workshop would combine in some kind of way
Well,
with
I-
Asian Americans and their
Look,
literary
look,
outputs
look.
on
We had
different
problems.
coasts.
We had
Er,
problems.
All right, hold on a
Y'all
second.
look corrupt.
All right, thank you, Susan. Okay. All right. And any other contributions to the questions from the Q&A? Althea, how would you like to, you have any more questions that you want? Yeah, you go.
One theme that keeps coming up.
You're on film.
One thing that keeps coming up for me that I'm really interested in is the, making money, making a living, producing yourself, and, evaluating these archives. And, I think, frankly, the question of whether this can be done in a capitalist system, whether this can be done in terms of capitalism, and what the contradictions are, and how we can navigate, and what are the tools that jazz presents to us? Jazz. Yeah, in terms of thinking through these issues, right? In terms of thinking through its own archive, right?
We have to know some people's numbers, right?
Some people's numbers? Attorneys?
Well, no, how much they got for their archives. For instance,
yeah.
I just came from Allen Ginsberg, who's a poet. He sold his archives about 20 years ago to Stanford for $1 million.
Nice.
There is an attorney now who's going around who says that he sold Amiri Baraka's papers to Columbia for $2 million.
Oh, great.
So are those good numbers? I mean, if they are, then that's something very serious to consider in terms of dealing with one's archive.
But I guess the trouble is then who's benefiting from that, right? And who's like, right, exactly, yeah.
I would like to add something to that. What would worry me about transferring personal archives to an institution like that would be that people that I care about might not have access to those same archives. And so when that happens, or if that happens, I want to put it into a situation that will make it available to all people, to the scholars and to students and everyone else who might benefit from some of that knowledge.
Well, it seems that that's the exception rather than the rule, because people can go to Schaumburg, but if you go up to where you want to look at scholarly stuff, well, I mean, you have to not have certain things in your possession. You can't pick photographs or pictures. I mean, so there are restrictions in that type of archive. Maybe you want something different than that, and maybe we could create something different.
No, I've been to the Schomburg, and I think my own archives are more extensive than theirs, than what they have in my particular field. I mean, it just happens to be that way. And mine are not necessarily as great as some other people that I might know about.
And where are yours housed? So do you have people come to your house to look at your archive?
Of course not. No.
And on that note,
but
I think it's unfortunately we've come to the end, and we have to continue this conversation coming up soon. And that's okay. I'd like to thank this great panel.
That's going to be another discussion.
Right. That's going to be on the next one. Yeah, thanks to the panel and thanks to the great questions that came from the audience and from Susan and Abby and Darren and everyone who was here. So I'd like to announce once again. You want to close?
No, you close.
You will close. Okay.
You're the closer.
Althea Sully Cole is the co-host and co-chair of this panel discussion, and she always gives great insight to these discussions and knows how to contextualize what's happening. Mr. David Henderson, Mr. William J. Harris, Sam Anderson, Mr. Warren Smith, Althea Sully Cole. Thank you. My name is Ross. And be sure to stay acquainted, and thanks to the People's Forum and the people who do the work to maintain this space regularly. The brother who documented today's discussion, we'd like to thank him for his work and for you for coming. And be sure to stay acquainted with what's happening here at the People's Forum. And Jazz and Self-Determination is coming back in July here on July 13th. On Albert Ayler's birthday, so we're going to have a discussion about Brother Albert on that time, and the courses, and thank you, Althea. This discussion, like last time, is a kickoff for classes called Jazz and Self-Determination, which is the same context where primary comes and teaches an actual class with coursework, more along the lines of people's education. So tomorrow we'll have Ben Young talking about Bill Dixon and the October Revolution in 1964, the Cellar Cafe and his efforts, and then it's going to lead into the Black Arts Movement. And June 10th, Professor Jeffrey Jacques will be here from the West Coast talking about free jazz in Detroit combined with social movements in Detroit. And so we thank you, and it was an honor for me within this constant learning experience that I've been having. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Take care.